There are moments in life that stop the world, not because of an explosion or a disaster, but because something so quietly powerful happens that every person who witnesses it feels it deep in their chest, like a hand reaching in and holding their heart still. This was one of those moments. And the people who were there that day, whether standing on the cold pavement of London Street or watching from thousands of miles away on a small screen, never forgot what they saw. They never forgot the way she looked. They never forgot the way he held her. And they never forgot the silence, that long, heavy silence that fell over an entire nation as two people said goodbye. It began, as many great stories do, quietly. The morning was gray. A thin layer of clouds stretched across the London sky like a worn blanket, the kind that offers little warmth but refuses to let go. It was the sort of morning that made people walk faster, pull their coats tighter, and keep their eyes on the ground. But on this particular morning, something strange happened all across Britain. People slowed down. They gathered at windows. They turned up the volume on their televisions. They stood in small clusters on street corners, strangers beside strangers, united by something they could not quite name but all deeply felt. Word had spread the night before, not in a dramatic way, not with breaking news banners or emergency alerts, but in the soft, creeping way that the most important news always travels, through whispered phone calls, through messages sent late at night, through the look on a news presenter's face when they try to keep their voice steady and almost managed it. The Prince and Princess of Wales were going to appear together in public, and it would be, by all accounts, the last time for a very long while. Catherine, Princess of Wales, had been through something that no headline could fully capture. For months, the public had watched and waited, concern growing with every passing week. She had stepped away from public life, and in doing so, had left a space that no one else could fill. People spoke about her with a tenderness that surprised even themselves. She was not just a princess to them. She was something more personal than that, a face they had grown up seeing, a woman whose quiet strength had become woven into the fabric of their everyday lives without them ever quite realizing it. And William. The people watched him too. They saw a man who stood in the storm without ever letting the world see how hard the wind was blowing. He carried out his duties. He appeared at events. He spoke when he needed to speak, but his eyes told a different story, and the British public, who had known those eyes since he was a young boy with sandy hair and a shy smile, could read them. He was tired. He was holding everything together with both hands and refusing to let go. The morning of the farewell was not announced with great ceremony. There had been no official press release, no carefully worded statement from Kensington Palace about what to expect. There was only the quiet understanding that had settled over everything like morning frost, delicate, unmistakable, and cold with the truth of what it meant. Catherine had chosen to wear a coat of deep navy blue. It was elegant without trying to be the kind of clothing that simply suited her, that made her look like herself at her very best. She wore her hair down, soft and slightly waved, the way the public had always loved most. And when she stepped out into the morning air, there was an audible intake of breath from the small crowd that had gathered. Not because she was unexpected, but because she was real. She was there. She was standing in front of them, and she was more beautiful and more fragile and more dignified than any photograph had ever managed to show. William was beside her before she had taken 3 steps. That was the first thing people noticed. Not how he looked, not what he was wearing, but how quickly he moved to be at her side. There was nothing practiced about it. It was pure instinct. The instinct of a man who had spent months being afraid and was now, in this final public moment, refusing to waste a single second being anywhere other than exactly where she was. They walked together across the courtyard, and the silence that followed them was the kind that only comes when something genuinely matters. The gathered crowd, press, staff, a handful of invited guests, seemed to collectively hold their breath. Cameras clicked, but even the photographers seemed to do it more gently than usual, as though they understood that they were not capturing a royal engagement or a public appearance, but something far more sacred than that. It was when they reached the steps that the moment happened. Catherine paused. It was only for a second, the briefest hesitation, the kind that might have gone unnoticed on any other day. But William noticed. He always noticed. He turned to her, and what passed between them in that half-second? That fragment of time, so small it barely existed, and yet somehow contained everything, was a look that the entire world would later struggle to describe. It was not sadness exactly. It was not fear. It was something older and quieter than both of those things. It was the look of two people who had built a life together, who had held each other through things the public knew nothing about, who had stood in rooms full of people and still somehow always found each other across the distance. He reached out and took her hand, not in the practiced, careful way that royals are sometimes seen to do in public, a polite holding gesture for the cameras. He took her hand the way you take the hand of the person you love most in the world when you are about to do something very hard. Firmly, completely, with his fingers wrapped fully around hers, and his thumb pressed gently against the back of her hand, as though he could transfer some of his own strength into her through that small point of contact. The crowd saw it. Every camera caught it. And somewhere across Britain, in sitting rooms and offices and school staff rooms and hospital wards, people stopped what they were doing and felt something move inside them that they would have struggled to explain if asked. They stood like that for a moment, just standing, just breathing. The gray morning wrapped around them, and the world watched, and nobody said a word. Then, Catherine looked up at him. She smiled, not the full, luminous smile that the public knew so well, the one that could light up a room from 50 feet away. This was something smaller and more private, the kind of smile that belongs only to the person it is aimed at. It said something without words. It said, I know this is hard. I know you were frightened. I know you would carry all of this for me if you could. And I love you for it. William smiled back. And that smile broke something open in the hearts of everyone who saw it, because it was not a smile of happiness. It was a smile of devotion so deep and so unshakable that even this moment of standing on a public step about to say goodbye in front of the whole world, could not reach the bottom of it. They began to move again, side by side, her hand still in his. They made their way toward the car that was waiting. The footsteps of the small crowd shuffled forward instinctively, as though pulled by some invisible thread. No one wanted to miss a single second. No one wanted to look away. Behind them, their children had appeared. It had not been expected, or if it had been, no one had said so publicly. The sight of them standing in the doorway, small and wide-eyed, watching their parents with a particular expression that children were when they sense something important is happening, but do not yet have the words for what it is, was almost too much to bear. The eldest stood very straight, trying to look older than his years. The younger ones pressed close together, shoulders touching, drawing comfort from each other in the way that siblings do. Catherine turned and looked back at them, just once, just for a moment. And whatever passed across her face in that instant was something that every mother in Britain felt in their own chest, in their own bones. Because there's a specific ache that belongs only to mothers, a particular kind of love that is inseparable from pain, and it was written across her face as clearly as any word. William saw it. He stepped close to her, close enough that his arm brushed hers, close enough that she could feel the solid, steady warmth of him beside her. He did not say anything. There was nothing to say. He was simply there, entirely, completely there, in a way that only truly good partners know how to be. They reached the car. A member of staff opened the door, then stepped back discreetly, giving them the small mercy of as much privacy as the moment allowed. William turned to Catherine, and in one of those gestures so natural and so unrehearsed that it bypassed every layer of public performance and went straight to the human truth beneath, he lifted his hand and touched her face. Just gently, just his fingertips against her cheek for one brief second. The photographers caught it. They always do. But even looking at the image later, people said it felt wrong to stare at it too long. Like it was too real. Like it belonged to them, to William and Catherine, and the rest of the world was simply lucky to have glimpsed it. She got into the car. The door closed, and William stood there on the pavement, watching the car, and did not move until it had turned the corner and disappeared entirely from view. The crowd stood with him. Nobody spoke. The gray morning held its breath. And somewhere deep in the heart of a nation that had watched this family through decades of joy and grief and scandal and love, something shifted. Something that had been held at arm's length by duty and decorum and the careful distance that public life demands suddenly felt very close, very human, and very, very tender. This was not the goodbye of a princess. This was the goodbye of a woman, a wife, a mother, and a man who loved her more than the world would ever fully know. The story was only beginning. After the car disappeared around the corner, William did not go back inside immediately. He stood on the pavement for a moment longer than anyone expected, and that extra beat of stillness, those few seconds where he simply stood there with his hands at his sides and his eyes fixed on the empty road, said more than any speech ever could have. The staff nearby kept a respectful distance. The remaining press held their cameras but did not lift them. Even the morning itself seemed to pause, as though the world understood that this man needed one private second inside a very public moment. Then he turned, squared his shoulders, and walked back through the doors. Inside, the children were waiting. It had been decided, carefully, quietly, in a way that the most important decisions are always made, that the children would not come to the departure point. They were too young for certain kinds of goodbye, but plans when it comes to children have a way of unraveling at the last moment. And so they had appeared anyway, drawn by some instinct that small people have when something important is happening around them, when the emotional temperature of the adults in their world shifts in ways they cannot name, but can absolutely feel. William came through the door and found them standing together in the hallway. His eldest looked up at him with eyes that were trying very hard to be calm and not quite succeeding. The younger ones moved toward him the moment they saw him, the way children do, without thinking, without hesitation, with the pure animal certainty that this is the person who makes things safe. He crouched down to their level, and whatever he said to them in those quiet minutes, nobody heard. Nobody was meant to, but those who were nearby said afterward that the hall was very still, and that the children's faces, which had been tight with something unspoken, slowly eased as their father spoke. By the time he stood up again, the eldest had managed a small, brave smile. The younger ones had tucked themselves into his sides, one on each, and he wrapped an arm around each of them and held them there. He was, in that moment, not a prince. He was just a father trying to hold his family together in the middle of something very hard. Across the city, in the hours that followed, the footage began to circulate. The moment of the steps, the touch of his hand against her face, Catherine looking back at the doorway, William standing alone on the pavement after the car had gone. These were not the carefully managed images that royal communications teams planned for weeks in advance. These were real. They were unguarded. And that realness hit the British public like a wave. Social media, which is so often a place of noise and argument and performative outrage, went quiet in a way that surprised even regular users. The posts that came in were not sharp or clever or designed to get attention. They were simple. They were honest. People wrote things like, "I didn't expect to cry, and I don't even know why I'm crying, and I've never felt like this about someone I've never met." A woman in Manchester wrote that she had been in the middle of her morning routine and had glanced at the television and then sat down on the floor of her kitchen and just stayed there for a while. A retired man in Edinburgh said he had watched the footage twice and both times had to take his glasses off and clean them, which his wife knew meant he was crying, and he knew she knew, but neither of them said anything about it. This was the strange and specific power of what William and Catherine had always represented. Not glamour, exactly, though there was certainly glamour. Not perfection, which they had never claimed, but something far more durable than either of those things. They represented the possibility that love, real love, the kind that bends and strains and holds on through things you never expected to face, could exist inside a life that was also lived in public. Under lights, under pressure, under the constant, unblinking eye of a world that was always watching, always judging, always hungry for more. And the world had watched them from the very beginning. There had been a time, not so many years ago, when they were young and the future was still an open road, when the photographs of them together were full of light and laughter. University corridors, ski slope, garden parties where they stood close to each other in the careful way of two people who were not yet ready to tell the world what they already knew. Britain had watched all of it, had formed opinions, had argued and speculated and hoped. And when they finally married, on that extraordinary April morning with the whole world gathered around screens from Tokyo to Toronto, it had felt like something important had been settled. Something good had been confirmed. But the years that followed were not a fairy tale. Real life never is. There had been difficulties. There had been strains that leaked out into the open no matter how carefully things were managed. There had been family fractures and public controversies and the particular cruelty of living through hard private things while millions of people watched and commented and decided what they thought they knew. William and Catherine had moved through all of it, not untouched. Nothing leaves you untouched, but together. Always in the end together. And then had come the hardest thing of all. When Catherine stepped back from public life, the nation felt it in a way that was difficult to articulate. There is something about the sudden absence of a presence you have taken for granted that clarifies exactly how much that presence meant to you. People realized, in those months of her absence, that they had been drawing something from her without ever fully acknowledging it. Her composure, her gentleness, the way she always seemed genuinely interested in whoever she was speaking to, the way she wore her role, not as a costume, but as something she had made entirely her own. She had been a constant in many people's lives for many years, and now she was gone from view, and the space she left was shaped exactly like her. William had carried the weight of her absence in public, while clearly carrying far more than that in private. People who encountered him during those months spoke later of a man who was still entirely present, still entirely professional, still entirely committed to everything he was meant to do, but quieter, not in a dramatic way, just in the way of someone who is spending a great deal of internal energy on something the world cannot see. It was on one of those quiet days, weeks before the farewell, that a story emerged from someone who had been at a small, low-key engagement. They said that William had been speaking with a group of people, all going very normally, when a child in the group, perhaps 6 or 7 years old, the age where honesty is still completely unfiltered, had looked up at him and asked very directly, "Is your wife going to be okay?" The room had gone completely still. Adults froze. The child stood there looking up at him with clear, earnest eyes, waiting for an answer. William had looked at the child for a moment, and then he had crouched down to the child's level, the same way he had crouched for his own children that morning, and he had said quietly and steadily, "Yes, she is very strong, and we all love her very much." The child had nodded, apparently satisfied with this answer, and moved on in the way that children do. But the adults in the room said that the moment had stayed with them, because in those two simple sentences was everything that William had been carrying for months. Not fear, not uncertainty, not the complicated, exhausting weight of being a man who was a prince and a husband and a father all at the same time in the middle of something enormous. Just, she is strong and she is loved. It was this that people were thinking about when they watched the farewell footage. All of this history, all of this accumulated love and struggle and endurance. The moment on the steps was not just a moment. It was the surface of something very deep, a visible tip of an iceberg of shared life that stretched far below what any camera could reach. The afternoon after the departure, Kensington Palace released a short statement. It was written in the careful, measured language that official communications always use, but even within those boundaries, something warm and human came through. It spoke of gratitude for the public support. It spoke of the importance of family. It used the word love in a way that official royal statements very rarely do, directly, simply, without qualification. People read it and felt the care behind it. That evening, A journalist who had covered the royal family for many years appeared on a television program and was asked what she thought the day had meant. She was a composed woman, experienced, not given to sentimentality on camera. She took a moment before answering. Then, she said, "I think what we saw today was the truth. We see a lot of performance in public life. We see a lot of managed moments and crafted images. And I'm not saying those things are wrong. They serve a purpose. But today was different. Today we saw two people who have loved each other for a very long time, facing something very difficult, and doing it with complete honesty. And I think the reason it affected so many people so deeply is because most of us know what that looks like. Most of us have had a moment like that in our own lives, or we've watched someone we love have it. And seeing it reflected back in the middle of all the grandeur and the cameras and the history felt like being seen. It felt like being told, this is real, and you are not alone in it. The studio was quiet for a moment after she finished speaking. Then the presenter said, "Yes," and moved on to the next segment. But several people in the studio, and many more watching at home, found themselves needing a second before they could move on too. Outside, the London evening had settled in. The gray clouds of the morning had not lifted, but the city carried on beneath them in the way that cities always do, full of movement and light and the ordinary, beautiful business of people living their lives. Somewhere in all of that ordinary life, 3 children were having their dinner and asking their father questions and not yet fully understanding everything that the day had held. And their father was answering them steadily and calmly and with the particular gentle patience that he had always shown them, while somewhere inside him something quiet and enormous turned and held on. The nation did not know all of this, but somehow it felt all of it, and it held on 2 days past. The footage did not fade the way most news does, replaced within 24 hours by the next urgent thing, the next breaking story, the next reason to look somewhere else. It stayed. It circulated and recirculated. People shared it with their parents. Parents shared it with their adult children. It appeared in group chats with no explanation, no caption, just the clip itself, because no caption felt equal to it. Something about those few minutes had planted itself in the collective memory of the nation and refused to be moved. But life, as it always does, continued. The world turned. The days grew shorter, and the air grew colder, and people returned to the 10,000 small concerns that make up an ordinary existence. School runs and work deadlines and supermarket queues and all the rest of it. The royal family carried on with their duties. Official engagements happened. Photographs were taken. Statements were released. And somewhere quietly and away from all of it, Catherine healed. Or rather, she did the thing that is harder and more real than healing, which is continuing. Waking up each day and choosing to face what needs to be faced. Doing the work that the body requires. Accepting help on the days when help is needed and finding reserves of strength on the days when it is not. Anyone who has been through something difficult, truly difficult, not the performative difficulty of minor inconvenience, but the kind that strips you down to something raw and essential, will recognize this. It is not dramatic. It is not photogenic. It is simply the quiet, relentless, human work of getting through. William was beside her for all of it. That much was understood, even by people who knew nothing specific, because it was simply who he was. Those who had watched him for years, not with the voyeuristic hunger of tabloid interest, but with genuine attention, had always known that beneath the titles and the ceremonies and the weight of everything he had been born into, there was a man whose deepest instinct was loyalty. Loyalty to the people he loved. Loyalty to the duty he had been given. Loyalty even to the painful parts of life that he could not fix or change, but could simply stay beside and refuse to abandon. He had learned this, many people believed, from loss. His mother had died when he was 15 years old, and that loss had shaped him in ways both visible and invisible. The boy who had walked behind his mother's coffin through the streets of London while the whole world watched had grown into a man who understood, at some cellular level. That grief is not a thing to be hidden or hurried through. That love does not end when the moment changes. That the most important things are not the grand gestures, but the small, steady, daily ones. The hand held, the word said, the presence maintained when maintaining it cost something real. Catherine had known this about him from early on. It was, many who were close to them believed, one of the foundations of what they had built together. She had her own understanding of quiet strength. She had demonstrated it for years in public and in private, in ways that had earned her a particular kind of deep respect that is different from admiration. Admiration can be given quickly. Deep respect takes time. So when the nation watched the farewell, they were not watching strangers perform emotion for the cameras. They were watching people they felt they knew, imperfectly, partially, through the narrow window that public life allows, but genuinely face a genuinely hard thing with genuinely real feeling. And that distinction made all the difference. Weeks after the farewell, letters began to arrive at Kensington Palace. This was not unusual. Letters always arrived. But the volume was different this time, and the nature of them was different too. They were not the formal, respectful letters of civic well-wishing that official occasions tend to generate. They were personal. They were honest. They were in many cases written by people who did not normally write letters at all, who felt compelled to do so by something they could not fully explain. A woman in her 70s from a small village in Yorkshire wrote that she had watched the footage with her husband of 50 years, and that it had reminded her of a morning many decades ago when she had had to say a hard goodbye of her own. She said she had thought she was the only person who understood what that kind of morning felt like. She said she was glad to know she was not. A man in his 30s from Birmingham wrote that he had recently gone through a separation from his wife, and that in the middle of his grief, he had somehow found himself watching the footage, and that seeing a man be completely, openly devoted to his partner, without apology, without performance, without pretending it was easy, had done something for him that he could not fully articulate. He said it had reminded him what love was supposed to look like. He said he was grateful. A schoolteacher in Wales wrote that her class of 10-year-olds had seen the footage on a shared screen during a moment she hadn't quite planned, and that one of her students, a quiet boy who rarely spoke in class, had looked up at her and said, "They really love each other, don't they?" She said she had told him, yes, they really do. She said it was the most straightforward conversation about love she'd had in years. These letters were not read publicly, and they were not shared with the press. But they were received, and they mattered, and they were added to a pile that grew steadily larger as the weeks went on. Because the British public, reserved, famously understated, culturally trained to keep emotion at a careful arm's length, had been moved. Really moved. And when the British public is really moved, they do not make noise about it. They write letters. They mention it quietly to their neighbors. They feel something shift inside them and go on with their lives carrying the shift without quite being able to name it. What they had witnessed was not simply a royal couple saying goodbye. What they had witnessed was something that reached beyond rank and title and all the complicated machinery of public life. They had witnessed two people who were completely, irreducibly human, who were tired and frightened and in love and devoted and doing their absolute best in a situation that their best would barely be enough for, refused to pretend otherwise. In a world full of carefully managed images and strategically crafted narratives and the constant pressure to perform everything, including pain, in the most palatable and presentable way possible, William and Catherine had simply been real. And realness, it turned out, was what people had been hungry for. There's a version of this story that ends here with the letters and the feelings and the nation holding something tender in its chest. But the real version does not end, because real things do not end. They continue. They change shape. They move through seasons. In the months that followed, Catherine did return. Not all at once. Not with the full brightness of before, because no one comes back from hard thing exactly as they were before it. They come back changed, which is not the same as diminished. Quite often it is the opposite. Change can mean deeper, steadier, clearer about what matters and what is not. It can mean a kind of hard-won peace that sits differently in the body than innocence did, that looks out at the world with eyes that have seen something and kept going anyway. When she appeared again in public, the response was extraordinary. Not the roar of celebrity spectacle, but something quieter and more profound, the sound of a nation exhaling. The relief of it, the particular joy of seeing someone you had worried about standing in front of you, upright and present and themselves, perhaps more themselves than ever. She smiled that smile, the one that could cross a room and land in your chest. And it was different, not lesser, but different. There was something behind it now that had not been there before, or perhaps had always been there, and was now simply more visible. A knowledge, a completeness, the particular expression of someone who has looked at the hardest things available and chosen, each day, to still be here. William stood beside her, as he always had, as he always would. They stood together in the morning light, and around them the world carried on in its vast and complicated way, and inside that world were millions of people who had carried this couple in their thoughts through a hard season, and were now quietly, deeply glad. There were no grand words spoken. They did not need to be. The image said everything that words would have only made smaller. Two people, standing together, having come through something. Still there. The nation looked at them, and the nation remembered the gray morning, and the hand held, and the touch against her cheek, and the children in the doorway, and the man standing alone on the pavement watching an empty road. And the nation understood, with the kind of understanding that lives below language, that what they had witnessed was not history in the grand and distant sense. It was history in the only sense that truly matters, the history of love and endurance and the quiet heroism of holding on. Not because it was easy, never because it was easy, but because some things are worth every single cost. And some people, when the world is watching and the morning is gray and the goodbye is real and the road ahead is uncertain, some people reach out and take the hand of the person they love and they hold on and they do not let go. William and Catherine were those people. They always had been. They always would be.